recently retired from Dana Petroleum.
Careful, retired. I remember that.
Yeah, well, I was trying to find a way of leaving you to choose the words carefully. So Graham, over to you, and you are going to, well, you can see the title. Is there a bus between what actually happens and what we promise? Graham, over to you.
Thank you,
Best to stand here. Yeah.
Okay. All right.
And then these two microphones.
Oh wow, goodness me. Well, good morning, everybody. I'm very honoured to be speaking here at David's request. Just let me say something about me and my qualifications, if any, to stand here. I mean, I'm the warm-up act for some very worthy folks. For Simon, wherever he's gone, if he's not left already. Marcus and Greg, who are sitting over there, and you can see Greg's picture up on there. But let me say something about me and my bona fides in the matter of talking to you about this. None really. I'm an accountant. No, that's not the case. This little entity is a little boutique consultancy that Mr. Coleman over there, and the guy at the top with the beard looks like a geologist. In fact, he's a rock mechanic. It's Professor Brian Smart, who used to run the Petroleum Engineering School at Heriot-Watt University. And the three of us decided that somehow or another we wanted to bring more powerful, honest, if you like, thinking to oil and gas matters, whether it was projects, exploration, reservoir engineering, or anything else. So we set up this thing that was supposed to be web-based called PetroMall. And the idea is that companies could select areas that they wanted help with, and you could use basically a social networking tool to get at academic thinking largely. Anyway, it's not worked very well, but nevertheless the entity continues. So that's what PetroMall is, and I'm here in that capacity. But as David was saying a few moments ago, I was latterly acting CEO of Dana Petroleum and the COO of it officially. Before then, I was working in Angola for a small explorer called Cobalt, who some of you may know, and that's an interesting story in itself about what they're up to. For BG in Kazakhstan, and then before then, about 30 plus years of BP in various places. So I've seen a lot of projects. I've seen a lot of capital spent. I've seen a lot of things come and go, and I hope I can illustrate with a few anecdotes as I do this little warm-up act here, some of the things I've seen and some of the relevance of it to the debate that David outlines that we want to have today. Do feel free to interact, by the way. I think we've got more time than we need, so as far as I'm concerned, I would be very grateful if people want to interrupt and shout out or whatever else. So that's me and PetroMall. Let me see if I get this right now. I've got to point it up there, and I've got to do that. And that's the pointer, it's that one. So what am I trying to do here? I mean, how do you get into this? This question over capital projects in E&P, as David's already alluded to, it's not just about that, it's capital projects more broadly in the world in which we live, but how do you get into it? So it's really to say as a warm-up, provoke some thoughts about risk and risk management, and see if we can sort of generate a different line of inquiry into risk and risk management. That was the origins of PetroMall, to try and get at risk in a better way, actually. The project management processes, these capital value processes, this sort of routine or procedure almost, that companies go to as something moves from a gleam of an idea through to, in our case, a discovery, through to a massive capital program quite commonly, and through then to running something. And those processes by which companies have sort of seemed to have adopted over the years, and do they work? I have a view on it, actually. I'm not sure that they work as intended, or at least they provoke a behaviour set that perhaps isn't as conducive to risk management as it might be. I want to say something about organisational models, and we'll come to that, and that's very relevant. And then just some closing thoughts on desired outcomes, and then the panel, which is Greg, Marcus and Simon, will be open to, they'll be giving their own views, and obviously a debate then can then follow. So I hope this is helpful. As I say, how to get into it, it's quite difficult to know where to start. I mean, give me a more tough subject, David, the bus between the CEO, the boardroom, the investors generally, the contractor universe, IPA have a say in all of this. For those of you who don't know, IPA, Independent Project Analysis, is it? Ed Merrow, anyway, are in the E&P industry very close to the operators and the community at large, giving views, retrospective views, more often than not on projects and their success or otherwise. Ed Merrow's done a lot of research. He's got a very thick book, which I was going to bring, but it wouldn't fit in my bag. But it's a thick book, which I recommend. But inside of that book, there's tons and tons of references to people examining this subject. And again, as David said, it doesn't just apply to E&P. Just doesn't apply to E&P projects and petroleum ventures. This is the conclusions from his book. I went to the back and just pulled out from Ed Merrow's book what needed to be done, what were his conclusions, and tried to work backwards from there. I just want to run through these. I mean, the first one is interesting, address the business technical divide. That was number one in the back of the book. And he said there is nothing more important than this, which I thought was interesting. Basically, what we're saying that business people meddling in projects cause a bad outcome was basically what that controversial statement seemed to be. That the inference being, the less you knew but were trying to drive something forward for the reasons you were trying to drive it forward as a project sponsor, in some way caused a bust between, the technicalities, the operational nature of a project and the business drive. That was number one on his list. He was more critical of business people leading an organization down the wrong road than he was of technical people speaking out. But he did point out that, technical people, project engineers, project general managers even, tend to sit quiet and wait to say, I told you so, or I could have told you if you asked me. At the end of it all, I'm sure people recognize that. My own little anecdote about this, I've got a couple of anecdotes along the way, and it'll refer to people some of you may know. So I'm in the job market, so I hope I don't offend anyone. It's not my intention to offend anybody here, so just so you know, I'm looking for a job, so if I offend anybody here, it wasn't intentional, so just be clear on that point. But this particular anecdote was quite a ways back in the Jurassic when I was a development engineer. I had a bit of a stand-up fight, sort of nose-to-nose point about water injection and the proportion of that secondary recovery method contributed to the reserves base and therefore the sanction case, the business case for the project. And the response I got back was, I can't tell that to the boss. He will be wondering what you've been doing all this time. Well, I'd only been in the job a month, so actually I haven't been doing very much, but I was just pointing out a truth from a reservoir engineer's point of view, but having been one at some point, the value, largely the value of a project, of an E&P project in its sort of final analysis is wrapped up in the reserves, in the proved and the probable reserves, as we all know. The P2 number is the first thing that's out of everybody's mouth. What's the P2 reserves? And a large portion of the P2 in this particular case was predicated on a water injection scheme for which we had a pilot going. And it was not at all clear that the water injection scheme was sweeping oil or repressuring the reservoir or anything like that. And that had been going for some time. Anyway, the point about all of this is the business technical divide. And I think this anecdote gives you the flavour of a bit of the problem. I can't tell the boss that we can't proceed. So we proceeded. Needless to say, the guy I had the nose-to-nose with was promoted big time, and I was left behind to sort of wash the dishes. So solitary lesson, That is an interesting point, address the business technical divide. People driving, project sponsors driving along, technical people feeling unempowered, unwilling, couldn't care less, whatever the motivation is about not saying what they really need to say. And as I say, surprisingly for me that this was the number one on his list. The second one I like a lot personally, and I think this was somewhat new thinking to me as I sort of reflected back on my recent life and the recent project I was involved in, formalise and institutionalise a shaping process. So it's fine to have a discovery. It's fine to have, something you're really excited about. I was with Paul Mayland of Kenya the other day. They've got these two wells in Senegal, and they're into an appraisal program. And I sat there thinking to myself, as his worry is about financing the appraisal program, getting that done, finding a basis for commerciality, and not a very easy place to be doing it, that if he's going to go, and if they are going to go into, ultimately a development, the degree to which you've got to shape what it is you're doing with all the stakeholders, formalise all of that, get it clear to everybody involved, not just the owners, not just the board, but ultimately the contractors, and especially in a place like Senegal, the government. And I'll come back to this theme. Formalise a shaping process before the go decision. Now, that's not, to my knowledge, that's not codified in any particular way in a capital value process, in a process sense. But formalising and shaping the fact that you are going to be making a significant investment for the good of a lot of people is something I don't think is done particularly well. I think it's very easy to go from discovery to execute. In other words, find something and then start building something, and then wish you hadn't and thought you thought about it a bit more up front. It's the front-end loading point in another guise, which I'll mention. Front-end loading, the world's best capital investment. My own anecdote about this was actually BTC, but really Azeri Chirag Ganashli in the Caspian. At the time, I was running what was the early oil project. Chirag was on stream. It was looking at 1 billion barrels then. A small platform, former Soviet Union. It was the experiment into post the collapse of the Soviet Union. Could Westerners invest? And basically, an old platform, the top was taken off like the top of an egg. A new one was put on. A new top sides was put on, and a scheme using refurbished and partly new lines was put into place. And I ran that. But then the big prize was the X billion barrels, 5 or something, in Ganashli and Azeri as the water deepened in the Caspian off Baku. And, there was the potential there for a very large North Sea style, and, Brent style large development with large platforms, large water injection schemes and so on and so forth. And the good thing about it, interestingly, was the fact that there was no export route. And you will know, I'm sure, recall the politics around the BTC pipeline. It didn't go anywhere for a very long time. It was in the middle of it. It was a geopolitical tennis ball for a long time between the Russians, who wanted the oil to go into the Transneft system so they could control things, and the oil to be exported out to Novorossiysk. USG was heavily involved in trying to undermine the former Soviet Union and make sure oil went through to Jehan so they could get their hands on secure supply of what was good quality crude oil from the Caspian into Western markets. That was shrouded in the notion that it would reduce cargoes and shipping through the Turkish Straits and the potential for a major accident there and the consequences of it. The Iranians were up to tricks, I suppose, trying to get the oil down to the Gulf and to Bandar Abbas or someplace and export through there. The point about all of this toing and froing around the pipeline and the export scheme allowed the project team to do a bang-up job on the upstream part of it, on the jackets, on the scheme, on the equipment, the front-end loading. The front-end loading index at the time was, it was off the clock. It was very high. They'd done it, recycled the engineering, recycled the procurement, recycled the contract strategy. Were they ready? They sure as hell were. And that was building jackets in Baku. An old Soviet jacket yard was refurbished. So the upstream part of that project you really couldn't miss. And that was my own personal experience of seeing something where front-end loading, fortuitous or circumstantial though it was, was a benefit to at least the upstream part of it. And that whole project, I'm sure, if you looked at it on a full cycle basis, at almost any prices, is pretty robust even now. This is, wow, I mean, the team staffing strategy, the HR point. Merrow makes this point very strongly. You can't wing it with people managing a major capital investment, given its complexity, given the reach, given the locations, given the nature of the contract world that you're in, and so on and so forth. I want to say some more about organizations and competency and capability and so on and so forth later on. But again, Merrow's conclusion is make sure you develop it. And this last one is quite blunt in its criticism of those of us who are, with owners, operators and sponsors, basically beating on the contractor and treating them, he puts it, like a commodity. I think that's kind of an interesting suggestion, that engineering, design, procurement and integration, commissioning, all the rest of it, is in some way commoditized in the oil and gas industry. As an engineer myself, I find that a bit of a tough thing to believe. So what is suggested here is that all the big companies, the big engineering houses that we know, the KBRs, the Kellogg's, all the rest, are not in a particularly good place with owners because of owners' propensity to sort of beat on them and put them on the defensive, and they reacting appropriately, or they react, in their view, appropriately when prices go up and they want more of the economic rent. So Merrow asserts that this relationship needs to be, his words, restore sanity to that relationship. And my own experience certainly bears this out, that with the contractor on the back foot, for whatever reasons, even at high oil prices, the outcome is not set fair. It's risky. It's more risky with a bad relationship. And that's not just the big guys either. It's all the way down the supply chain, I would assert. Whoever it is who's doing your contracting work for whatever it is. And just think of all the subcontractors that are around. Just think how they are if owners and sponsors' behaviour permeates down into the subcontractors. Why should I bother? So that's Ed Merrow's view on what needs to be done in his book. I don't know if anybody wants to say anything or challenge it. So I'll continue. And there's some data to back it up. Those of you who know and love FPSOs, this is from a forecast that was done a while ago. It's a bit old, the data is, but at the time it was done, there were 54 FPSO fleet developments going on somewhere in the world. 13 were already existing FPSOs and were being redeployed. In other words, they were in yards to be done to in some way, shape, or form. I want to come back to that point. And 41 were new builds, and in the worst case, you could expect 16 months delay, and I suspect that's gotten worse, quite frankly. And yet, so much of our business, even in the North Sea, that's predicated on fixed structures, or is floating. And obviously, in the deep water, it is. Large, probably from the Gulf of Mexico. But in the deep water more broadly, West Africa and everywhere else, the whole tenet is FPSOs and all the attendant things that go with it. So this is sort of evidence of the problem. So what can I say about that? Here's the evidence. Here's isn't it awful, you might say. So I thought it would be interesting to sort of ask the question, why do the marginal project? I mean, if you're just one small company and you have one project, that's one thing, why do it? And if you are a big company, a big owner with a large portfolio of projects, why do the marginal one? So I sort of thought it'd be interesting to put some thoughts down and shout out others. I guess I gave up, but the usual reason is it's a good strategic fit, isn't it? Good strategic fit. Great for the company, great strategic fit. This is our strategy. This is therefore why we must do this. We need to grow. Well, of course. I mean, what other choices do we have? If you're not continuously improving, you're continuously declining in our business, it seems to me, or maybe continuously deteriorating. So that's a sort of an interesting notion. We need to grow. So that drives us as sponsors to take the decision to proceed. We have the technology, a source of value, the nous, the smarts, the competitive advantage with respect to some technical aspect. We image seismic better than the next man, and so on and so forth. Easy to sort of make the statements. A source of competitive advantage is our technology or our IP or something like that. So that's why sponsors take the decision. We have the financial muscle. That sometimes means, we've got nothing else better to do with our cash other than return it. It may mean that. And maybe that consideration isn't given enough airtime. If we have the excess cash and we're opportunity constrained, we do the marginal project, and then that changes that position somehow or another. We're already in it. We've got a load of sunk capital. We don't want to take a write-off, a write-down. We don't want the embarrassment of all of that. We don't want to admit that our explorers in their exploration memorandum said it was a lot bigger than it really turned out to be and that we should proceed, and so on and so forth. So we're already in it, and me too. Let's continue. We're better than anybody else. If we don't do it, then somebody else will. And they'll make a far worse job of it than we will. So we're better than anybody else. We told the minister we would. This was personal experience in a certain place I was, where, again, all the analysis, technically, commercially, economically, and this was a sort of a risky thing. It had a certain concentration of H2S in it, which makes things more tricky, as you know. I was told the minister has been told. The minister expects. I go, but I'm a shareholder. That's not relevant. The minister expects it to be done. Now, that sort of falls into the strategic fit idea. Well, maybe there is a bigger game going on in a country. And there was, to be fair. And it could have jeopardized, a bigger, a longer run game. A stepping stone to a strategy. But at least be cognizant of the point that's being made. We told the investors we would, self-evident, or it's somebody, the bosses, whoever, pet project. I mean, there are others. I tried to think of them. I couldn't. I mean, I'm sure people would, please.
Well, one that leaps out for me is, what else are we going to do?
Well, yeah. I sort of alluded to that in this idea that we got the money, we got the people, we're sitting around, what else are we going to do if there's nothing else better to do? So it pushes you down the road of risk-taking when perhaps your risk appetite is not quite that. Anybody else? Why do it? Why do we do it?
This one is who says it's marginal. Where you started.
Yeah, okay, yeah. So whose definition of marginal is it? Yeah. I guess I meant marginal in a portfolio sense. If you've got doing 5, why do the 6th? I meant it in that sense rather than economically marginal, but you're right. I mean, if it's economically marginal, how do you de-risk it? And when do you give up? When do you stop saying this is not going to work and take the hit? Has anybody ever stopped a project? Cause one to stop? You're talking later on. Talk about it. Simon will tell you how a project came about to be stopped. I've been close on a couple of...
We started it again.
Oh, you did? All right. Okay. Oh, well, that's different then. You sort of stopped it. All right. Well, there you go. You go straight from the horse's mouth. I mean, I've come close on 2 occasions to wanting to stop something. If it were left to me, I would have stopped it. It didn't make sense. And I could have made the rational argument as to why it should have been stopped. This is... I've got to move. I can't stand here. I'll hear the voice on the recording. So what about the poor old CEO who's faced with all of this? Now, what are these things? I think we need to be really clear about what an E&P project is. It's a complex thing, multiple work faces, multiple interfaces. It's not off the shelf. We're going to think about standardization later on. Look, I mean, I have a view on this. I think standardization is great and it's a great ideology, but these things aren't made to order. They're not made to put into stock and be taken off the shelf. They are designed to a concept and they are made to a design. I think we need to be real clear, and the complexity of that shouldn't be underestimated. So the standardization cry we need to be very selective as to how we stay. I saw you shake your head there, Simon. That's good. I think you were violent. Hopefully, that was violent agreement.
Every reservoir is different.
And every fluid is different.
But as
And
far as everybody else is concerned, they're all the bloody same.
well, yeah, but great. And obviously, stating the obvious: dollars, resources, capital deployed somewhere in the world. No, I mean, if the definition of a major project, I don't know what it is. There's various ones: $500 million, $1 billion. Anyway, it's a big number. They're inevitably complex in the supply chain internationally. As some people will know, shape of the company significantly. If you're a small company, you have one or two big things. These are company makers or breakers. And the wider environment, my own experience in the places I've worked, you know, I would say Karachaganak in Kazakhstan was significant. One of three big things. Kashagan, best not mentioned really. Tengiz and Karachaganak, those three things were enormously important to the well-being and the future of not just the state, but you know the people who worked in them of Kazakhstan. So if you have a portfolio, you have a whole program of these as a company, then what? So the poor old CEO has got this sort of distribution of things to look at. The point I want to make about this is the concept of risk. I think at the portfolio level, you know, the argument is that risk evens itself out. It's a normal distribution. Some things will go better than expected, some things will go worse than expected. But on average, the average is as expected. And that mindset, I think, is easily fallen into in a large company. And if you're a small company with only one of these things, you've got to be very careful about what the risk distribution looks like. Is it log normal to the downside, or is it log normal to the upside? Seems to me. If it's log normal to the downside, then you've got a lot of, you've got quite an uphill battle to deal with in the case of one company, where the portfolio effect can't wash out. You can't sort of mask things that go wrong with one or two projects. There's another problem with all of this in the portfolio, is managing these things as owners and sponsors, is having the critical mass of staff to keep an eye on everything. I think personally that's why Exxon, Chevron do well. Shell, they do well because their critical mass of staff is built up at a portfolio level, and the skill set they have to steward these things works. It's a lot harder if you're smaller than them, and most people are. So the CEO has to be optimistic versus misrepresenting the truth. I'll come back to that with a little diagram in a minute. And these next 2 points, in fact, these 3 points, the last three, optimistic, faced with escalation, and rationalise things when they go funny, is really captured in this diagram, which I just want to talk to you about. This is from somebody I know, actually. Graham Winch is a professor of project management, I think, at University of Manchester. In my spare time, which I have a lot of, I'm an honorary professor of petroleum engineering there, and I know Graham. And if you look him up, you'll find a lot of sort of stuff academically written about this. It alludes to what David was saying earlier on. The research suggests that, and it's not just about E&P business, is that sponsors see things from, a perfect outcome point of view. I sort of looking at Greg here. Well, I remember in BP, if a phrase was said by the boss, it was already done. It was finished. We will produce 250,000 barrels a day. So your mental leap had to be, yes, then that's done, let's move on to the next one. The fact that there were sort of several years of hell in between to get there, if you got there, was neither here nor there. So the perfect future state for a CEO, for a sponsor, is kind of like where people operate from. And the question with all of that, to me, is whether or not these cost estimates and schedules are made in good faith. Are they good faith estimates, or are they just porkies? Are they self-delusion? Are they sort of, I need to look good, whatever it is? That follows on then, that this idea that you could strategically misrepresent something, or there's a danger of it, that you strategically misrepresent something. It's good for our strategy, I believe in it, therefore it must be good, therefore our strategy is working, therefore we proceed. And then the inevitable the escalation occurs, cost, schedule, complexity, scope. Escalation of a project then ramps up, and people start to get worried and nervous and put out press releases saying, well, it isn't quite like what we thought, but it's still on track. The sort of managing the message around these things. Then, of course, at some point with all of this, you get to, so whose bloody fault was it? It was somebody on the outside as a rule. Exogenous is better, the contractor particularly, but it's somebody else's fault. We had something I worked on recently. We had a whole month of the drilling rig shut down because of the weather in the North Sea. In January of this year, it was blew a hoolie for a whole month, and this rig came off the well and sat and bobbed around for 30 days. And I was kind of like, what do you want me to do? What can I say? It's the weather. And then the project outcome is the kind of outcomes that we sort of are worrying ourselves about here, nagging about the fact that they're not on time, on budget, and the returns to shareholders aren't what we originally thought, and we sort of have to squirm around and make a case for it. I mean, another way of saying this is, well, I believe it. This is my own baby. I believe it. I'm going to browbeat others into believing that it's good. I'm going to chuck lots of money at it. Hopefully, in the worst case, not chuck good money after bad, and then I'm going to blame somebody on the outside. It's kind of like an interesting piece of research, but it's very much applied to other major projects in the world, as I see it. The papers I've read, a bit like the one David mentioned, whether it's IT, whether it's transport, as you say, HS2, think back, the Thames flood barrier, Concorde, all of these things were never on time and on budget, never as planned. So there is, I think, bringing it back to E&P, I think we have a better chance with our type of projects than we do with, major infrastructure projects like HS2 or a major sort of flagship thing like Concorde. We have a better chance in our industry to give it the time it takes to get this right, and there are no scapegoats. I mean, not to say that you'll eliminate risk, but you don't have to look around and say, well, explain yourself. And that was to say, if you want to have a mind to, Graham Winch is quite a well-written professor on all of this. I thought it'd be interesting, as I say, I wanted to sort of get at risk. I mean, one of the ways I was taught to think about capital projects was, let's discuss, bring out, articulate the sources of value. And I made some points here. I'm not really quite sure what these first three are meant to say. And the point about the cost of capital, the risk premium being not enough at the project level, what that really means to me is that, if you use just a nominal rate for discounting your project, 10%, because that's the company economic policy, then you make a mistake. It's a different thing to do a modification on some sort of existing facility as it is to do an FPSO in wherever, in West Africa. And I think the stuff that I've read about this, the people theme comes through, that they are a real constraint on accessing sources of value. In other words, accessing the value of the project, which is a theme that recurs throughout all the research that I've seen. So I was sort of in the world of turning this around and say, well, what are the sources of potential value loss, which is what that's meant to mean, the multiplicity of risks. And all those risks, project, industry, competition, the weather in the North Sea, country fiscal, the market, interest rates, oil prices, all of that, the multiplicity of risk. And I think the point I want to make about it is that what we need to learn to do is to articulate this and actually harness it, not run away from it. We need to the sources of potential value loss are the sources of value. It's a bit like a production system. If you go and look for your losses in a production system, why is this pump leaking? Why is this switch constantly tripping us out every 2 weeks? If you go and find out what they are and fix them, then the value comes back. I'm trying to turn the argument around. That what we should be articulating is the sources of potential value loss as an industry, and then addressing them. The multiplicity of risks. Anybody know what that is? You don't know what this is, you haven't seen it, but this is the comprehensive list of causes for a fatality. I just drag it out of my files. It's got a million reasons for what could be the underlying cause of one event, the death of a person. It's a fatality investigation tool. I'm not trying to sort of trivialise the idea of the death itself. That's not the point. But this is a fairly large list of things that could possibly have happened to cause the death of somebody. Just think in the project, what would it look like for a major project? This comprehensive list of causes would be huge. It would fill this room. And I would assert it's not within the capability of any organisation, of a CEO or his executive team, or even probably the project team, to sort of have a handle on everything. So I come back to the idea that the source of potential value loss needs to be examined very thoroughly, and we should not be romanced by the sources of value themselves. We know what they are anyway.
Graham,
Everybody still here?
Graham,
Yes.
one thing that you don't have on your risk list, is you refer to it in the IPA book, is the shaping process. And what IPA don't seem to appreciate is that they have no way of assessing the shaping process and the quality of it. And you don't have it on explicitly on your list there. And I would assert that it's because we tend to have linear thinking,
Yeah.
engineering type approach to projects, and shaping is all about people who aren't linear.
That brings me very nicely on to the very point. So, as I said at the beginning, I wanted to examine it for that exactly that reason, the project processes that now are put more or less, I think, germane in some way, shape, or form to owners in the industry. I think they are anyway. Correct me if people have never seen this before. Fine, I suspect you all have in one guise or another. But the essence of it is to access, explore, appraise. David and his colleagues get all the kudos and get medals and are lauded by the Geological Society, all the rest of it. And then somebody, think about David, somebody says, let's go, which is something I want to examine. And then a bunch of people then engineer it, build it, commission it, and then some poor old, old lag like me runs it, refurbishes it, tries to push it out in time before we call it a day. And it's all very distinct. And I think, exactly to your point, Greg, the first bits of all of this, and this end state as well, isn't shaped well enough. Or at what point do you exit? At what point do you get out? There's all the get-rich-quick schemes of sort of explore, have a sanctionable project and peddle it at a high price to some major, and we can all get rich. But I don't think that's the point about all of this. It's, when are the right times to refurbish? When are the right times? And, people can't see out that far. But I think the shaping process, I think the problem with this is, at each stage you go through, you shut the door like the horse is bolted, or you shut the door, the horse is in the stable and it can never get back out again, is the problem with this. And all companies, I think, adopt this approach in some way, shape or form with a different language probably. I think it's a problem. I think it's become a problem because it promotes the idea of, well, I wasn't responsible, I did my bit, and so on, throw it over the fence. And if it's not been formulated properly up front, then this structure shapes the behaviours of project teams. Supposing it was more like this. I think for me, Dan Golden's are very good at this. They insist at some point in your lease, you declare commercial discovery. And that's a big phrase, declaring commercial discovery. To whom? And commercial to whom, in what, or against what set of parameters is it commercial? And I think that's the bit that we miss. We have said, as sponsors, owners, CEOs, it's commercial, but does your engineering contractor agree? And does he care? Does the pump supplier care that it's commercial? All he cares about the fact that he's building a pump for you is commercial for him. And I think, you've got to sort of get everybody to see this at the enterprise level rather than the individual component level, to get a better sense of ownership of the project as a whole, and not have people just default and have a squabble about liquidated damages, or say they're going to stop the job or whatever it is, and send the whole thing into a spiral. I think this is much more relevant to the way we should think about projects. As I say, commercial for who? For the owners? For the banks? For the state? It's commercial in what sense? For contractors? In what sense is it commercial? For the staff that work for you, it means a job for them for the next 3 years. What does it mean? What does commerciality really mean for people? And I think, that milestone is so key. You've just got to return to it all of the time and say, well, we declared this commercial. Why did we do it? And why isn't it now? Or why is it less so now? So it's a myriad of perceptions, assumptions, and risk on a very grand scale is what a declaration of commerciality is about. And you as the CEO or the board or the executive or the project management team can't know everybody's views of what commerciality is, but I think you've just got to remind people of it somehow. Hence the shaping point about what it is we're doing here. I wanted to talk about organisations. They're always flavour of the day, the demographics of the industry. Certainly current prices are going to sort of change all that dynamic again, no doubt. But I think with respect to projects, I want to make some, I hope, reasonably piquant observations. Projects are temporary configurations of permanent organisations, aren't they? They come and they go. They are, what did I say, determinate. They have an end point. Somehow or another these things end. They're superimposed, though, on an organisation that is not determined. It's indeterminate. You don't implement, unless you deliberately intend to wind a company up. But most people taking on these things, they're there for the long run, they will say. And the organisations are indeterminate, and the people that are in them plan to be there, for much of their careers, I suppose. And just think of how all this stacks up. So you have if you've got a portfolio, you have project-led organisation, P1 through PX. You have functions going across F1 through FX. I know of a company that also had geographic, 45 degrees to all of that, geographic area 1 through X. The complexity of setting something up to do a temporary exercise, I don't think we give it enough, we don't give it a chance. We just sort of dump it in there and hope for the best, is my view of what I've seen of these things. And I think I'm trying to make a point about the two middle things around the owners. Projects are not their core business, are they? Exploring for and discovering hydrocarbons are the core business. Producing hydrocarbons and getting is the core business. A project is a sort of means to an end to do all of that, arguably. But for the contract universe, they are their core business, and they're managing a casual come-and-go workforce, depending on their workload. What I think is that the organisational construct, the design, the time taken to get this right up front is just as important as a part of shaping the project. If you just hope for the best, put some guy in there and just hope it works, contract a load of people in temporarily. I've seen it happen. I've seen it happen whereby the workforce has not had any pride of ownership in the project. It's had pride of ownership in cranking up the man hours. Natural behaviour. So E&P owners, I assert, they have to be system integrators of the assets, of the performance of the assets, of the performance of the project team as a whole. The amount of effort that needs to go into this, I think, can't be understated.
Graham, I think you should sort of...
Do you want me to stop?
Well, how many more slides?
2. I thought you told me to go slide on. Fill in the time. So anyway, some considerations. Project owners, your control mechanisms, your internal controls, internal assurance and external audit. That's the Toyota's ethos about walking the job. Can't say it in Japanese. Walk the project in all phases and look for early warning signs. That's been very much Toyota's success story. Human resource management, recognise what it is, and organise to manage the interfaces of a temporary organisation to a permanent one. Just reflect on that. I think organisational design for these things is really key and not given enough time. So there we are. I won't go through them if you want to move on, David. So these are my sort of thoughts. They're not very powerful ones, but some of the things that I think we don't do quite as well as we should are up here. And as I say, I think you've always got to go back to where you started. You made a declaration of a commercial discovery.
of slowing us down even more, I'd question. I mean, if you look at this sort of strategic financial interface that you mentioned, one of the two or three bits of things, one of IPA's observations from looking at a couple of hundred projects was that a big source of problem is when there's a strategic request to go faster. So you know, and I've had this experience of this an anecdote, you know. So you belly up at the group chief executives meeting. You show them a project which is going to cost the company a couple of $2 billion, and you finally get to the key economic slide, which is actually your commercial person has not actually done a lot of work on, but it shows the rate of return to be 12%. And the group chief executive says, well, actually, didn't you know the right answer was 20%? And you can get that by going a year quicker. So shortening, you know, discovery to first oil from 5 years to 3 or something. I know that's 2 years. Huh? I mean, have you seen that? And is that an unfair characterization of a complex discussion, that it can be that simple?
Well, I've certainly seen that kind of, as it were, behaviour and that drive for all the reasons a CEO or a board may want to sort of demonstrate its efficacy. I think the real issue is the practical one, is make it go faster. But to make it go faster, you have to mobilise a whole system, a temporary one at that, to go faster. And the thing is, they seem to have, for whatever reason, their own wavelength, these things do. I mean, you know, a good example is the North Sea. To build something now, you have to have a written scheme of verification to meet the safety case requirements, and the HSC's got to see all of that. That has got its own wavelength, and the engineering requirements and the documentation, for example, to achieve all of that are enormous. So you can say, I want you to do this 6 months faster, but throwing money and throwing people at it, it's limited to what you can do. So I think I would rather start with, you know, a real thorough understanding at the beginning of what the pace of this thing really is and can be, and where the upsides are, there are sources of value, and then get the commitment up front, trying to access them. But to be told when you're sort of, I don't know, a third of the way in or something, that you need to shorten the schedule by a year, you don't know what's going on in a yard. You don't know whether or not, I mean, particularly now, the lead time was, on subsea trees, was 52 weeks. Recently, up until recently anyway, you could not get a subsea tree in 52 weeks. Or longer. So, I mean, to say it is one thing, to actually operationalize it is another. So I think it's in the shaping. You've got to recognize schedule risk, and you've got to recognize schedule upside up front and go fall out for it. And then, if it's a good news story, it is.
Okay. Right, let's move on. Greg?